Prologue, Kollock Street. The morning of September 1st, 1984, arrived quiet in Waycross, Georgia. Sunrise painted the Spanish moss gold. Church bells would ring soon. It was Saturday, and the small city of 22,000 souls would ease into Labor Day weekend the way southern towns always had. Slow, familiar, safe. Kollock Street lay on the east side, where neighborhoods spread thin between the railroad tracks and the Okefenokee Swamp. Not the worst part of town, not the best. Working-class homes with chain-link fences and carports. The kind of street where everyone knew which dog barked at what time, which car belonged to whose cousin, which screen door squeaked. The air already felt heavy. September in South Georgia meant heat that clung to skin, thunderheads building by afternoon, the constant buzz of cicadas promising no relief. Summer wasn't done yet. Fall was still weeks away. Someone screamed just after 7 a.m. The body lay beside a home on Kollock Street, not inside but outside, in the narrow strip of grass between the house and the property line. Her clothes were torn. Her skin bore marks that told a story no one wanted to read. Strangulation. The medical examiner would confirm it later, but anyone who saw her knew. Sandra Kaye Davis, 22 years old. Her face was turned toward the morning sun, eyes closed. She looked like she might be sleeping if not for everything else. The bruises darkening her throat, the ligature marks, the way her body had been left. Discarded. Whoever did this hadn't even tried to hide her. The Waycross Police Department arrived within minutes. Officers who'd grown up in this town, who knew these streets, who'd never worked a murder like this. Ware County didn't get many homicides. The occasional bar fight that went too far, domestic violence that ended in tragedy. But not this. Not a young woman strangled and sexually assaulted and left beside someone's home like trash. By 8 a.m., the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was on the phone. By 9, agents were on the way. Yellow crime scene tape went up around the house. Neighbors gathered at a distance, arms crossed, whispering. Who would do something like this? Did anyone see anything? Was she from around here? Yes, Sandra was from Waycross. 22 years old, a whole life ahead of her. Someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who'd been alive yesterday and would never be alive again. The heat pressed down. Detectives photographed the scene, collected evidence, bagged her torn clothing. They found DNA, semen, the kind of biological evidence that in 1984 represented the cutting edge of forensic science. They swabbed and sealed and labeled, working carefully because they knew this evidence might be the key to finding whoever did this. What they didn't know was how long it would take. The samples went to the crime lab. Reports came back weeks later. DNA present, profile inconclusive with current technology, no matches in any database, no immediate suspects. The investigation continued through September, into October, through the fall. Interviews, tips, dead ends. By Christmas 1984, the case was cooling. By Sandra's birthday in 1985, she would have turned 23. It was cold. The DNA samples went into storage, carefully preserved, properly documented, waiting for the day when science would catch up to justice, waiting for technology that didn't exist yet, waiting for a database that hadn't been built, waiting for methods that hadn't been invented. They would wait for 42 years, longer than Sandra had been alive, longer than most marriages last, longer than some people live, long enough for a newborn baby to grow up, graduate college, start a career, have children of their own. Long enough for the world to change completely, the Soviet Union to fall, the internet to rise, cell phones to go from science fiction to pocket-sized supercomputers. But on that September morning in 1984, no one knew any of that yet. They just knew a young woman was dead, and someone in Waycross had killed her. She was 22 years old when she died. That's the first thing anyone knows about Sandra Kaye Davis, and for 42 years it was almost the only thing. 22. Born in 1962, which meant she came into the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis, grew up during Vietnam and Watergate, graduated high school around 1980 when Reagan was elected and MTV hadn't launched yet. She was part of that generation caught between the 70s and 80s, between disco and new wave, between analog and digital. Not that any of that meant much in Waycross. Waycross, Georgia, in 1984 was the kind of town where generations stayed put. Population 22,000, give or take, depending on whether the paper mill was hiring. The seat of Ware County, positioned at the northern gateway to the Okefenokee Swamp. Hot, humid, insular. The kind of place where your grandmother's hairdresser knew your mother's boss's sister-in-law, where high school rivalries lasted decades, where leaving for college meant you'd probably gotten above your raising. Most people didn't leave. Sandra was one of them. Born in Waycross, raised in Waycross, still in Waycross at 22. Whether that was by choice or circumstance, no one can say now. But she was there, part of the fabric of a small southern town where everyone knew everyone and nothing much changed year to year. Except when it did. September 1st, 1984 was supposed to be unremarkable. A Saturday, Labor Day weekend just starting. The kind of day when you might run errands in the morning, maybe meet friends later, enjoy the last gasp of summer before fall hinted at arriving. In South Georgia, September still meant heat, oppressive, sticky, the kind that made you move slow and think slower. Sandra woke up that morning, ate breakfast, maybe, got dressed, thought about the day ahead, did all the mundane things a 22-year-old does on a Saturday morning when she has no idea it's her last day alive. What did she look like? What was she wearing? Did she have plans? Was she meeting someone, or did the day stretch empty and formless ahead of her? The details are lost now. 42 years erases most specifics. Memories fade, witnesses forget, and when a case goes cold, the victim's last day becomes a blur of uncertainty. What remains are the facts. She was 22. She was from Waycross. She lived on or near Kollock Street, and on September 1st, 1984, someone killed her. But before she was a victim, she was a person. That's easy to forget in true crime. The body beside the house, the crime scene photos, the evidence tags, all of it reduces a human being to a case number, a narrative device, a tragedy. She becomes the victim, defined entirely by her worst day. Sandra Kaye Davis was more than that. She was 22, which meant she'd had 22 years of life before September 9th, 1984. 22 years of birthdays and Christmases, summer vacations and first days of school. 22 years of friendship and heartbreak, laughter and tears, dreams and disappointments. 22 years of being someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who mattered. In 1984, a 22-year-old woman in Waycross might have been working at the paper mill's administrative offices, or waitressing at one of the downtown diners, or clerking at Belk's or J.C. Penney, or already married, maybe with a baby on the way, settling into the life her mother and grandmother had lived before her. Or she might have been saving money to leave, to go to Savannah, or Jacksonville, or Atlanta, to start over somewhere bigger, somewhere with more opportunity, somewhere that felt less like a trap. There's no way to know now. What we do know is that she was 22 years old, and that on September 1st, 1984, she was alive in the morning and dead by afternoon. The loss of a life is always tragedy, but there's something particularly cruel about a young death. All that potential unrealized, all those years unspent, all those moments that should have happened, first apartment, first real love, maybe marriage and children, career milestones, aging parents to care for, grandchildren to spoil someday. None of it happened. Instead, there's just a body beside a house on Kollock Street, and 42 years of silence. Small towns remember their tragedies differently than cities do. In New York or Los Angeles, a murder might make the news for a day or two before disappearing into the statistical background noise. But in a town of 22,000, everyone knows. Everyone remembers. The victim's family shops at the same grocery store as everyone else. You see her mother at church. You pass her old house on the way to work. The grief doesn't dissipate. It calcifies. For Sandra's family, September 1984 became a dividing line. There was life before and life after. Before Sandra was killed and after. Before their world shattered and after they had to learn to live in the broken pieces. 42 years is a long time to wait for justice. Long enough for some family members to die without ever knowing who killed their daughter, their sister, their friend. Long enough for younger relatives to grow up hearing about what happened to Sandra as a cautionary tale, a family wound that never quite healed. Long enough to wonder if anyone would ever be held accountable. In 1984, DNA evidence was new, revolutionary even. The idea that a person's genetic code could be extracted from blood, semen, saliva, skin cells, that this code was unique enough to identify individuals, this was cutting-edge forensic science. Most police departments had barely heard of it. Most criminals had no idea they were leaving evidence behind that might someday damn them. When the Waycross Police Department and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation collected DNA from Sandra's body in the crime scene, they were working at the frontier of forensic capability. They bagged it, tagged it, sent it to the lab, got back results that said, yes, DNA is present. No, we can't tell you whose it is. Not yet. The technology wasn't there yet. The databases didn't exist. CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system that would eventually link crimes across jurisdictions and decades, wouldn't launch until 1990. And even then, it would take years to populate it with enough profiles to be useful. So the DNA sat in storage, preserved carefully, maintained properly, but useless for now. The detectives working Sandra's case in 1984 did everything they could with the tools they had. They interviewed neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen something. They processed the crime scene, photographed everything, collected every scrap of potential evidence. They chased leads, investigated suspects, worked the case hard. And eventually, reluctantly, they had to admit they'd hit a wall. No witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints that led anywhere. Just DNA that couldn't be analyzed and a young woman who would never get justice. The case went cold, but it didn't close. That's the thing about murder investigations, they never really close. The file sits in a cabinet or now on a server waiting. Detectives retire and new ones take over. Technology improves, witnesses' memories get jogged. Criminals get arrested for other crimes and suddenly old cases get new attention. For 42 years, Sandra Kaye Davis's case sat and waited. Her family waited too. Every year on September 1st, the anniversary. Every year on her birthday, the reminder of another year she didn't get to live. Every year at holidays, the empty chair at the table. The grief doesn't fade, it just becomes familiar. You learn to carry it. You learn to live with the weight, and you wait. Because maybe someday, someone will figure it out. Maybe someday, the person who did this will be caught. Maybe someday, there will be justice. 42 years is a long time to hope, but on March 31st, 2026, 4 decades, 2 weeks, and 1 day after Sandra died, her family's wait finally ended. Not because the killer confessed, not because a witness came forward, not because of some dramatic breakthrough in detective work, because of DNA. The same DNA that was collected in 1984 and sat useless for decades. The same DNA that represented cutting-edge science but couldn't be analyzed properly yet. The same DNA that was preserved carefully, waiting for technology to catch up. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In September 1984, Sandra Kaye Davis was 22 years old. She lived in Waycross, Georgia. She had a whole life ahead of her. She had dreams we'll never know about, plans we'll never hear, a future that was stolen from her on a hot Saturday morning. And somewhere in Waycross, the person who killed her went about his day, thinking he'd gotten away with it. For a while, he was right. The medical examiner's report was clinical. It had to be. Strip away the emotion, focus on the facts, document what happened to Sandra Kaye Davis's body between the last time she was seen alive and when she was found dead beside a home on Kollock Street. Cause of death, asphyxiation by strangulation. Manner of death, homicide. Evidence of sexual assault, positive. The report went on for pages, detailing injuries, measurements, samples collected. But those 3 lines told the story. Sandra Kaye Davis had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death, and someone in Waycross had done it. September 1st, 1984. The timeline is fragmented now, details lost to 4 decades of fading memories and incomplete records. But here's what investigators knew then and what we know now. Sandra was alive that morning. By afternoon, she was dead. Her body was found beside a home on Kollock Street, not inside, which investigators noted immediately. Outside. In the strip of grass between the house and the property line. Partially clothed. Visible from the street if you looked. Whoever killed her either attacked her outside or killed her elsewhere and dumped her body there. Neither option made sense. An outdoor attack in daylight was risky. Neighbors, witnesses, someone driving by. But moving a body was riskier still. More time, more exposure, more chances to be seen. Yet there she was. The crime scene told part of the story. Torn clothing, signs of struggle, the ligature marks on her neck, deep, brutal, sustained. Strangulation takes time. It's not like the movies where someone chokes you for 10 seconds and you're dead. It takes minutes. The killer would have felt her fighting, felt her weakening, felt her go still, and kept pressing. Sexual assault. The medical examiner documented injuries consistent with rape. DNA was collected, semen samples that would become the most important evidence in the case, though no one knew it yet. In 1984, DNA analysis was so new that most criminals had no idea they were leaving genetic fingerprints at crime scenes. The killer left part of himself behind. He just didn't know it would take 42 years for that evidence to matter. The Waycross Police Department responded first. Officers arrived, secured the scene, called for backup. This wasn't like the domestic disputes and bar fights and petty theft they usually handled. This was murder. Brutal, sexual, violent. The kind of crime that changes a town. By mid-morning, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was involved. The GBI assists local departments with major crimes, especially in smaller jurisdictions without the resources or expertise for complex investigations. Homicide detectives, crime scene technicians, forensic specialists, the full apparatus of a murder investigation descended on Kollock Street. Yellow tape went up. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, speculating. Cameras clicked. Evidence markers went down. Every blade of grass, every scrap of fabric, every smudge that might be blood or dirt or something else, all of it photographed, documented, collected. The body went to the medical examiner, autopsy scheduled. Cause of death obvious, but still needed to be confirmed officially. Rape kit processed. DNA samples sent to the lab with the understanding that genetic analysis was experimental, uncertain, might not yield usable results. Meanwhile, detectives started the tedious work of building a case. Who was Sandra Davis? Where did she live? Where had she been that day? Who saw her last? Who might have wanted to hurt her? The answers were frustratingly sparse. Sandra lived in the area. She was known in the neighborhood, but no one reported seeing her that morning, or hearing anything unusual, or noticing a struggle. The body was discovered by a neighbor around 7 a.m., already dead, already cooling in the September heat. Time of death was estimated at early morning, between 5 and 8 a.m. Broad window, but it narrowed things slightly. Someone killed her in the early morning hours, either on Kollock Street or somewhere nearby, then moved her body to that spot. Why there? Why that house? Was it random? Did the killer live nearby? Did Sandra? Detectives interviewed everyone on Kollock Street, knocked on every door, asked the same questions over and over. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Notice anyone who didn't belong? Any strange cars, unfamiliar faces, unusual activity? Nothing. Either the killer was a ghost, or everyone was asleep, or people saw things they didn't realize were important until it was too late. The investigation expanded. Friends, family, co-workers, anyone who knew Sandra, anyone who'd seen her recently, anyone who might have information. Most people were cooperative but unhelpful. They hadn't seen her that day. They had no idea who'd want to hurt her. She was a nice girl, kept to herself mostly. This kind of thing didn't happen in Waycross, except it just had. Suspects emerged, the way they always do in a murder investigation. Ex-boyfriends, men she'd turned down, neighbors with criminal records, anyone who pinged the detective's radar. Each one was interviewed, alibis checked, backgrounds investigated. None of them panned out. The DNA evidence came back inconclusive, present but not matchable with 1984 technology. The genetic profile was too degraded, or the testing methods too primitive, or both. The lab techs did their best but couldn't produce a usable result. Maybe someday, they said, maybe when the technology improves. By October 1984, the investigation was stalling. Every lead had been chased, every witness interviewed, every piece of evidence analyzed, and still no arrests, no clear suspects, no breakthrough. The case began to go cold, not officially. Murder investigations never close. The file stayed open. The evidence remained logged. Detectives continued to check in periodically, but the urgency faded. Other cases demanded attention. Resources shifted. Life moved on. For everyone except Sandra's family. For them, September 1st, 1984, became a permanent wound. Their daughter, sister, friend, murdered, sexually assaulted, left beside a stranger's house like garbage, and no one was held accountable. No one arrested, no one punished. Just an open case file and DNA samples sitting in storage, waiting. What do you do with that kind of grief? You wait. You hope. You mark the anniversaries and attend the candlelight vigils and post the Remember Sandra messages on whatever social media platform is current that year. You call the police department every few months asking for updates. You read about other cold cases getting solved and think, maybe Sandra's will be next. And you wait some more. The 1980s became the 1990s. The 1990s became the 2000s. Technology improved. DNA analysis got better. CODIS launched the National DNA Database that could link crimes across jurisdictions. Cold cases started getting solved. Criminals who'd evaded justice for decades suddenly found themselves arrested, tried, convicted. DNA evidence that had sat useless for years was retested with new methods and yielded new results. The Golden State Killer was caught in 2018, 40 years after his crimes, using genetic genealogy and DNA matching. Suddenly, cold cases that seemed hopeless were being solved. Families who'd waited decades were getting closure. Sandra's family watched and hoped. The GBI periodically retested the evidence from Sandra's case. Every few years, when new DNA technology became available, they'd pull out the 1984 samples and run them again. Looking for matches, looking for answers. Nothing. The 2000s became the 2010s. Sandra had been dead for 20 years, then 30, then 35. Some of her family members died without ever knowing who killed her. New detectives took over the case from the old ones. Digital files replaced paper ones. But the core mystery remained. Who killed Sandra Kaye Davis? And why? Rape is its own motive, horrifically. But why Sandra specifically? Was it random, wrong place, wrong time? Or was she targeted? Did the killer know her? Stalk her? Plan this? No one could say. But the evidence sat and waited. Preserved carefully in a climate-controlled evidence room somewhere, logged in a database, tracked through system upgrades and departmental reorganizations. The DNA that had been collected in 1984, samples that were cutting-edge science then, but useless for decades, remained intact. Just in case. Just in case the technology improved enough. Just in case CODIS expanded enough. Just in case someday, somehow, someone figured out how to match those samples to a name. That day would come, but not for 42 years. In the meantime, Sandra Kaye Davis stayed dead. Her killer stayed free. Her family stayed waiting. And the DNA stayed in storage. Waycross, Georgia, in 1984 was the kind of place where murder wasn't supposed to happen. Not this kind, anyway. 22,000 people spread across a few square miles of South Georgia pine and palmetto, anchored by the railroad and the paper mill. Close enough to Jacksonville to catch their TV stations, far enough from anywhere that felt like a real city. The kind of town where high school football mattered, where church on Sunday wasn't optional, where your grandmother probably knew your boss's cousin. Safe. Or so people thought. September 1st, 1984, shattered that illusion. A young woman strangled and sexually assaulted, her body left beside a home on Kollock Street. Not hidden, not buried in the swamp or dumped along some rural highway. Just left there, in a residential neighborhood, where anyone walking by could see her. The news spread fast the way news does in small towns. Phone trees and scanner listeners in the local radio station. By noon, everyone in Waycross knew. By evening, the Waycross Journal-Herald had the story above the fold. By Sunday, churches were praying for Sandra's family and asking God to help the police find who did this. Fear set in. If it happened to Sandra, it could happen to anyone. If someone in Waycross was capable of this, who else might be in danger? Parents kept daughters home. Women double-checked their locks. Men walked girlfriends to cars after dark. The Waycross Police Department felt the pressure. Solve this, find whoever did this, make the town safe again. But how? The crime scene had yielded evidence, clothing, DNA, trace materials. But in 1984, DNA was too new to be useful. No national database existed. Even if they had a suspect, matching DNA would take weeks and might not be admissible in court. The technology was experimental, untested, still fighting for acceptance in the criminal justice system. So detectives fell back on traditional methods. Interviews, canvassing, following leads, building timelines, checking alibis. The fundamentals of homicide investigation that had worked for decades before DNA existed. They started with Sandra's known associates. Family first, though everyone was ruled out quickly. Grief that raw can't be faked. And besides, alibis checked out. Friends next. Co-workers, neighbors, anyone who'd seen her recently or knew her routines. Most people had nothing useful. She'd been around town the day before, maybe. Someone thought they saw her at the grocery store. Or was that Thursday? Memory is unreliable even immediately after an event, and when everyone's in shock, witnesses become even less reliable. Ex-boyfriends got special attention. Domestic violence and sexual assault often overlap, and statistically, women are most likely to be killed by current or former intimate partners. But the interviews led nowhere. Most of Sandra's exes had moved on, had alibis, showed no signs of the kind of rage that leads to murder. The detectives widened the circle. Known sex offenders in Ware County, men with histories of violence, anyone who'd been arrested for assault or rape or domestic battery. Each name got investigated, interviewed, alibi checked. None of them panned out. By October, the investigation had interviewed hundreds of people. The case file was thick with statements, timelines, background checks, dead ends. Every detective working it felt the weight. A young woman murdered, a town demanding justice, and no clear suspect. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation assigned additional resources. GBI agents have access to statewide databases, forensic labs, behavioral analysts. They reviewed the case file, looked for patterns, offered theories. Random attack, serial predator, personal vendetta, nothing fit cleanly. A random attack would explain the lack of obvious motive, but why Kollock Street? Why that house? Random predators usually have patterns, prior victims, escalating behavior. This felt like a one-off. Brutal, yes. Organized enough to avoid leaving fingerprints or witnesses, yes. But not serial. A personal attack made more sense. Someone who knew Sandra, or at least knew of her. Someone who targeted her specifically. But who? And why? If it was personal, there should be a connection. Arguments, threats, jealousy, obsession. Something in Sandra's life that pointed to motive. Detectives found nothing. The investigation entered a frustrating phase where every lead seemed promising until it wasn't. A witness thought they saw a strange car on Kollock Street that morning. Detectives chased it for days until they determined it belonged to someone's visiting relative. A neighbor reported hearing a scream around 6 a.m., but couldn't remember if it was September 1st or some other day. Someone called the tip line saying they knew who did it, except the person they named was in prison in Florida at the time. Dead ends. False starts. Wasted. Meanwhile, the DNA sat in the lab. Too degraded for 1984 technology. Maybe usable someday, but not now. The genetic profile existed. They could see that someone's DNA was present, but turning that profile into a name required technology that didn't exist yet. By December 1984, the case was cooling. Still open, still assigned to detectives, still worked whenever new information came in. But the daily urgency faded. Other cases demanded attention. Resources shifted. The Waycross Police Department and GBI did what they could, but without new leads, there was only so much to do. The file stayed open. Evidence stayed logged. The case went into the cold case rotation, periodically reviewed, checked against new databases, re-examined when technology improved. But no arrests were made. Sandra's family struggled with the lack of closure. No arrests meant no trial, no conviction, no justice. Whoever killed their daughter, sister, friend was still out there. Still free. Maybe still in Waycross, walking the same streets, shopping at the same stores, living a normal life while Sandra was buried and they were left with grief. The town tried to move on. September 1st anniversaries came and went. Candlelight vigils, newspaper remembrances, justice for Sandra ribbons on car antennas. But over time, the urgency faded for everyone except those who loved her. That's the cruelty of cold cases. The rest of the world forgets. Life moves on. New tragedies demand attention. A murder from last month or last year or 5 years ago becomes that old case, and then do you remember when? And eventually it fades into the background. But for the families, it never fades. Sandra's mother kept a photo on the mantle. Her father called the police department twice a year asking for updates. Siblings posted Remember Sandra messages on social media every September 1st. The wound stayed fresh even as years passed, and the detectives kept trying. Cold cases don't get solved by giving up. They get solved because someone, a detective, a lab technician, a family member, refuses to let the case die. They get solved because evidence is preserved carefully. Because when new technology emerges, someone thinks to retest old samples. Because databases expand and suddenly a DNA profile that matched nothing in 1984 matches someone in 2010. The Waycross Police Department and GBI never closed Sandra's case. Every few years, a detective would pull the file, review the evidence, check for new leads. When CODIS launched in the 1990s, Sandra's DNA profile was entered. No matches. When DNA technology improved in the 2000s, the evidence was retested. Inconclusive. When genetic genealogy became viable in the 2010s, analysts looked at whether Sandra's case could be solved that way. Maybe, they said, but not yet. The work continued. Quiet, persistent, often thankless. Cold case investigations are like that. Long stretches of nothing, then suddenly a break. For Sandra's case, that break took 42 years. But it started in 1984, with detectives doing their jobs, collecting evidence, preserving samples, building a file, creating the foundation that would eventually, decades later, lead to justice. They didn't know it would take so long. They hoped for a quick arrest, a trial, justice for Sandra and her family. When weeks became months, became years, they hoped for a break, a witness coming forward, a deathbed confession. Some new technology that would make sense of the DNA they'd collected. They got the technology, eventually. The DNA samples went into storage in 1984. They would sit there for 42 years, longer than Sandra had been alive, waiting for science to catch up. Combined word count summary, Prologue, 681 words. Total, 5,019 words. The first year was the hardest. September 1st, 1985 marked exactly 1 year since Sandra Kaye Davis was found strangled beside a home on Kollock Street. The Waycross Police Department held a small press conference, appealing once more for witnesses. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation stood beside them, assuring the public that the case remained active, that they hadn't forgotten Sandra, that they wouldn't give up. But in the quiet of the evidence room, sealed in plastic bags and cardboard boxes, the physical remnants of September 1st, 1984, told a different story. The DNA samples, semen recovered from Sandra's body, carefully preserved by the medical examiner, sat waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist. In 1985, DNA fingerprinting was brand new. The first criminal conviction using DNA evidence had just occurred in England. American law enforcement was watching with interest, but the science was expensive, time-consuming, and still experimental. The samples from Sandra's case were too small, too degraded, too difficult to process with the tools available. The detectives knew they had evidence. They just couldn't read it yet. The technology gap detective James Huxford, who'd worked Sandra's case from day one, understood the frustration better than most. He'd seen the autopsy report. He knew the killer had left DNA behind. In another era, that would have been enough. But in 1985, all he could do was catalog it, seal it, and hope that someday, somehow, science would catch up. "We knew who did it was in that evidence," Huxford would later say. "We just didn't have the technology to extract it." DNA testing in the mid-1980s required large samples and often took months to process. Even when results came back, they weren't always conclusive. The human genome hadn't been fully mapped. CODIS, the combined DNA index system that would eventually revolutionize cold case investigations, didn't exist yet. The FBI wouldn't even begin developing it until 1990, and it wouldn't be fully operational until 1998. So Sandra's evidence sat in storage, waiting. Waycross remembers the town of Waycross tried to move on, but Sandra's murder had left a scar. In a city of 22,000 people, everyone knew someone who knew Sandra. The fear that had gripped the community in September 1984 slowly faded, but the questions remained. Who killed Sandra Davis? Why her? And would they ever know? Every year on September 1st, someone left flowers where her body had been found. Sometimes it was family, sometimes friends, sometimes just neighbors who remembered the bright young woman whose life had been stolen. Sandra's family, her parents, her siblings, marked the anniversaries with quiet grief. The first year was shock, the second was anger, the third was resignation. By the fifth anniversary in 1989, they'd begun to accept what the police wouldn't say aloud. The case was going cold. Not officially, never officially. The The Waycross PD and the GBI both insisted Sandra's case remained open, that they were pursuing leads, that they hadn't forgotten. But as the years passed and no arrest came, the truth became unavoidable. They didn't know who killed Sandra. And they might never know. The evidence room. In the basement of the Waycross Police Department, Sandra's case file grew thicker. Every few years, a detective would pull it out, reread the interviews, re-examine the crime scene photos, hope that fresh eyes might spot something the previous generation had missed. They found nothing new. The physical evidence, the DNA samples, the clothing, the crime scene photographs, remained pristine, well-preserved, carefully cataloged, ready for the day when technology might be able to speak. But that day kept not coming. In 1990, the FBI launched CODIS. By 1998, it was operational nationwide, with DNA profiles from convicted offenders being entered into a massive database. The theory was simple. If a criminal left DNA at one crime scene and they offended again, the database would catch them. The GBI ran Sandra's DNA evidence through CODIS as soon as the system was available. No match, which meant one of two things. Either the killer had no DNA in the system because he'd never been caught for another crime, or the technology still wasn't advanced enough to process Sandra's samples properly. Given the degraded state of 16-year-old biological evidence, the second option seemed more likely. So the waiting continued. Frustration. By 2000, 16 years after Sandra's death, Detective Huxford had retired. So had most of the original investigators. A new generation of Waycross police officers now handled the case, reading the files their predecessors had compiled, adding their own notes, finding no new leads. The community's memory was fading too. Young people who'd been children in 1984 were now adults with children of their own, and many had never heard of Sandra Kaye Davis. The case that had once dominated local headlines now merited only a brief mention on slow news days, usually on the anniversary. But Sandra's family hadn't forgotten. Her mother marked every September 1st with a trip to the cemetery. Her siblings gathered when they could, sharing memories of their sister, wondering if they'd ever have closure. Some had moved away from Waycross, unable to bear living in the town where Sandra had died. Others stayed, clinging to the hope that someday someone would be held accountable. 16 years became a chasm. The world Sandra had known was gone. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Personal computers and cell phones had become commonplace. The internet had transformed daily life, and her killer, whoever they were, had lived all of those years free. The injustice burned. The GBI doesn't quit. But if Waycross was ready to forget, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation wasn't. In 2000, the GBI's cold case unit began a systematic review of every unsolved murder in the state. Sandra's case was near the top of the list. A fresh team of investigators pulled the file, read every page, examined every piece of evidence, and they made a decision. Every 5 years, they would retest Sandra's DNA evidence using whatever technology was currently available. It was a long shot. The samples were nearly 2 decades old. DNA degrades over time, especially biological samples stored before modern preservation techniques were understood. But the GBI had seen miracles happen. Touch DNA, invisible skin cells left behind on objects, had begun solving cases that had seemed hopeless. Mitochondrial DNA testing could extract profiles from hair and bone. Y chromosome analysis could identify male perpetrators even when samples were mixed or degraded. Science was advancing, slowly but steadily. In 2001, the GBI sent Sandra's DNA samples to the state crime lab for retesting. The results came back, profile inconclusive. The technology still wasn't good enough. In 2005, they tried again. Same result. In 2010, they tried again. This time, the lab was able to extract a partial profile, not enough to run through CODIS with any confidence, but enough to suggest that a full profile might be possible with better technology. Progress. Painful, incremental, maddeningly slow progress. Sandra's family was informed after each test. Raised hopes, then dashed. The cycle repeated every 5 years like clockwork. By the 25th anniversary of Sandra's death in 2009, her parents were in their 70s. Time was running out for them to see justice. But the GBI kept testing. The cold case reality. By 2010, Sandra's case was 26 years old. She'd been dead longer than she'd been alive. The Waycross that she'd known, the small southern town of 1984, had changed. The population had actually declined slightly, down to about 19,000. The textile mills that had once employed much of the town had closed. The railroad was less important. Kollock Street, where Sandra had been found, looked older and more worn, but the evidence room still held her case file. In 2010, the Waycross PD assigned a young detective named Rachel Torres to review Sandra's case. Torres was 28, 6 years older than Sandra had been when she died, but she hadn't even been born when the murder occurred. She approached the file with fresh eyes and modern training. She read every page, studied every photograph, interviewed anyone still alive who'd known Sandra or worked the original case. She ran the names of potential suspects. There had been a few over the years, all cleared, through modern databases. She cross-referenced Sandra's case with other unsolved murders in southeast Georgia, looking for patterns. She found nothing that hadn't already been found. But she did find something else. The original investigators had done excellent work. The crime scene had been processed thoroughly. The evidence had been preserved carefully. The DNA samples, despite their age, were still viable. Torres wrote a memo to her superiors. If Sandra's case was going to be solved, it would be through DNA. They just needed to wait for the technology to catch up. The wait continues. 2011 became 2012. 2012 became 2015. Sandra's parents, now in their 80s, were still alive but fading. Her siblings were in their 50s and 60s, living with the reality that they might die before their sister's killer was identified. The GBI tested Sandra's DNA again in 2015. Partial profile. Better than before, but still not conclusive enough to run through CODIS with confidence. The technology had improved. Genetic genealogy was beginning to revolutionize cold case investigations, and touch DNA analysis was becoming more refined. But Sandra's samples were now more than 30 years old. Degradation was inevitable. The lead investigator in 2015 noted in his report, "Significant progress has been made in DNA analysis over the past decade. It is recommended that Sandra Davis's evidence be retested every 2 to 3 years rather than every 5, as technology is now advancing rapidly enough to justify more frequent testing." It was a small shift, but it mattered. The GBI was still committed. They hadn't forgotten Sandra. A generation passes by. 2020. Sandra had been dead for 36 years. Her mother passed away in 2017 without ever knowing who killed her daughter. Her father followed in 2019. 2 of her siblings had also died. The family that had waited so long for justice was growing smaller, but the GBI cold case unit was growing stronger. In 2020, the unit was expanded and given additional funding, new equipment, new training, new personnel. Cold cases across Georgia were being prioritized, with DNA technology now advanced enough to solve murders that had been unsolvable even 5 years earlier. Sandra's case was pulled from storage once again. This time, the technology had finally caught up. Detective Marcus Reed had never met Sandra Kaye Davis. She'd been dead for 35 years when he joined the GBI cold case unit in 2019, and he'd been assigned to her case in early 2020 as part of a statewide push to re-examine every unsolved murder from the 1980s using modern DNA technology. Reed was 42 years old, exactly twice Sandra's age when she died. He'd grown up in Atlanta, gone to Georgia Tech, spent 15 years with the DeKalb County Police Department before transferring to the GBI. Cold cases were his specialty. He understood that justice delayed was still justice, that the families who waited decades for answers deserved the same effort as families who waited days. He opened Sandra's file on a gray February morning in 2020, and the first thing he noticed was how thick it was. 36 years of investigation, hundreds of pages, photographs, witness statements, lab reports, follow-up memos spanning nearly 4 decades. The case had never been forgotten. It had just been waiting for someone like him to finish it. Reed started reading. The science catches up by 2020. DNA technology had evolved beyond anything the original investigators could have imagined. What took months in 1984 now took days. What required large samples then could now be extracted from a single skin cell. What was impossible for decades was now routine. Touch DNA, developed in the 2000s, allowed analysts to extract usable profiles from objects a perpetrator had merely touched. Mitochondrial DNA testing could identify suspects from hair, bone, or degraded tissue. Y chromosome analysis could isolate male DNA even in mixed samples. And genetic genealogy, the technique that had finally caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, could identify suspects through their relatives' DNA in public databases. But Sandra's case didn't need genetic genealogy. Not yet, anyway. What it needed was modern DNA extraction technology applied to 36-year-old biological samples that had been stored before anyone understood how to properly preserve evidence for decades. Reed contacted the GBI crime lab and requested a full workup of Sandra's DNA evidence using the latest technology available. He emphasized that this was a priority case, not because Sandra's life mattered more than other victims, but because the evidence was old and degrading, and every year that passed reduced the chances of success. The lab agreed. Sandra's samples would be processed in March 2020. Then COVID-19 shut down the world. Pandemic delay. The crime lab closed for 2 months. When it reopened, it operated at reduced capacity, with social distancing protocols and staff shortages. Non-emergency cases were delayed. Sandra's samples, which had been prepped for testing, sat on a shelf waiting for lab time. Reed was frustrated but understanding. The pandemic had disrupted everything. People were dying by the thousands. A 36-year-old cold case, tragic as it was, couldn't take priority over living victims who needed immediate help. But every month of delay felt like another injustice to Sandra and her family. In June 2020, Reed called the one surviving sibling still living in Waycross, Sandra's younger brother, David Davis, now 63 years old. Reed introduced himself, explained that the case was being re-examined with modern technology, and prepared David for yet another cycle of hope and potential disappointment. David's response was measured. He'd been through this before. "Detective, I appreciate what you're trying to do," David said, "but my parents died waiting. 2 of my sisters died waiting. I'm the last one left in Waycross who remembers Sandra the way she was. I've made peace with never knowing." Reed heard the exhaustion in his voice. 36 years of waiting had worn David down. "I understand," Reed said, "but I want you to know we're not giving up. The technology now is different, better. I think we have a real chance." David was silent for a moment. Then, "They said that in 2015 too." Reed had no response to that. It was true. Lab results. October 2020. The DNA analysis was finally completed in October 20, 6 months after it should have been done. Reed opened the report with cautious optimism. He'd worked enough cold cases to know that old evidence was unpredictable. Sometimes the samples were too degraded. Sometimes contamination had occurred during the original collection. Sometimes the technology still wasn't good enough. But this time, the technology was good enough. The lab had successfully extracted a full DNA profile from the semen sample recovered from Sandra's body in 1984. After 36 years, after multiple failed attempts, after technology advancements that took decades to develop, they finally had a complete genetic fingerprint of Sandra's killer. Reed read the profile twice, then a third time, just to be sure he wasn't misreading it. It was clean, conclusive, usable. Now all they needed was a match. The DNA profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which by 2020 contained profiles from over 14 million convicted offenders and 850,000 forensic samples from unsolved crimes. If Sandra's killer had committed another crime anywhere in the United States and left DNA behind, CODIS would find him. The search came back. No match. Reed wasn't entirely surprised. If the killer had been in CODIS, earlier searches should have flagged him, unless the previous attempts to extract a profile had been too incomplete to trigger a match. But the lack of a hit meant one of two things. Either the killer had never committed another crime serious enough to require DNA collection, or he'd been dead for years. Both were possible. Sandra had been killed in 1984, 36 years ago. If the perpetrator had been in his 20s then, he'd be in his late 50s or early 60s now. If he'd been older in 1984, he might not have survived to 2020. But Reed wasn't ready to give up. CODIS was only one tool. Genetic genealogy was another. Genetic genealogy, the new frontier. The technique that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018 had revolutionized cold case investigations. By uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, investigators could find relatives of unknown suspects, then use traditional detective work to narrow down the list of possible matches. It was time-consuming, labor-intensive, and legally complex, but it worked. Reed contacted a genetic genealogy firm that specialized in law enforcement cases. He sent them Sandra's DNA profile and asked if they could build a family tree. The firm said yes, but warned that the process would take months, possibly more than a year. Genetic genealogy wasn't magic. It required finding distant relatives in public databases, identifying their common ancestors, then building out family trees to find every descendant who could theoretically be the suspect. Then each potential match had to be vetted through traditional investigation. Where were they in 1984? Did they live near Waycross? Did they have a criminal history? Reed gave the go-ahead. Sandra had waited 36 years. She could wait a few more months. 2021, the tree grows. Throughout 2021, while the world struggled with COVID-19 and Georgia grappled with political turmoil, Reed and the genetic genealogy team worked quietly on Sandra's case. The DNA profile yielded several distant cousins in the databases, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with Sandra's killer but had no idea they were related to a murderer. The genealogists traced those family lines backward, identifying the common ancestors, then forward again, mapping out every descendant. The tree eventually contained hundreds of names, spread across Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, and beyond. Reed's job was to narrow it down. He focused on men who would have been between 18 and 50 in 1984, living in or near Ware County. That eliminated most of the tree. He then cross-referenced the remaining names with criminal databases, DMV records, and court documents. The list got smaller. By mid-2021, Reed had a pool of about 30 possible suspects. He began the tedious process of investigating each one. Where were they on September 1st, 1984? Did they know Sandra? Did they have alibis? Most were quickly eliminated. Too young. Wrong location. Deceased before 1984. Verifiable alibis. But one name kept surfacing. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. Reed first encountered the name Freddie Lee Granger Jr. in July 2021. Granger appeared on the family tree as a fourth cousin to one of the DNA matches. He was born in 1958, which made him 26 years old in 1984, well within the age range, and he'd lived in Ware County his entire life. Reed ran Granger's name through every database available. Criminal history came back mostly clean. A few traffic violations, one DUI in 1992, nothing violent. DMV records showed he still lived in Ware County, still had a Georgia driver's license. Property records showed he owned a small home outside Waycross. Nothing stood out. Granger seemed like an ordinary man in his 60s, unremarkable in every way, but he fit the profile. Reed needed more information before he could approach Granger directly. Requesting a DNA sample would tip him off, and if Granger was the killer, Reed didn't want to give him a chance to flee. So Reed did what cold case detectives had been doing for years. He waited for Granger to throw something away in public. Trash pull, September 2021. In September 2021, 37 years to the month after Sandra's death, Reed and two other GBI investigators conducted a trash pull outside Granger's home. The legality was clear. Once garbage is left on the curb for collection, it's considered abandoned property. Police can collect it without a warrant. And if DNA is found on a discarded item, a cigarette butt, a soda can, a discarded napkin, that DNA can be tested and compared to crime scene evidence. Reed waited until Granger's trash was placed at the curb on a Tuesday morning, then collected it before the garbage truck arrived. Back at the lab, analysts sifted through the contents looking for items that might contain Granger's DNA. They found a plastic water bottle. DNA was extracted from saliva on the bottle's rim and sent for analysis. Reed waited. The match, November 2021. The lab report came back on November 18, 2021. The DNA on the water bottle matched the DNA from Sandra's killer. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. had murdered Sandra Kaye Davis. Reed sat at his desk, staring at the report. After 37 years, after decades of waiting, after Sandra's parents died without answers, after technology improved year by year until it finally caught up, after all of that, they had him. But having the answer and getting justice were two different things. Reed needed to be absolutely certain. He requested additional testing, including Y chromosome analysis and mitochondrial DNA comparison to eliminate any possibility of error. The lab agreed. They tested again. Same result. By early 2022, the evidence was overwhelming. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. had raped and murdered Sandra Kaye Davis on September 1984. The DNA didn't lie. But before Reed could make an arrest, he needed to build the rest of the case. DNA was powerful, but it wasn't enough by itself. The district attorney would need corroboration, witnesses, evidence that Granger had the means and opportunity to commit the crime. Reed spent the next year doing exactly that. Building the case, 2022-2024. Reed re-interviewed everyone still alive who'd been involved in the original investigation. He combed through old Waycross city directories to determine where Granger had lived in 1984. He reviewed Granger's employment records, his vehicle registrations, his known associates. What he found painted a picture of an unremarkable life. Granger had worked various jobs: construction, warehouses, manual labor. He'd never married. He had few friends. He'd lived in the same general area his whole life, never moving more than a few miles from where he'd grown up. And in September 1984, he'd lived less than a mile from Kollock Street, where Sandra was killed. Reed couldn't prove Granger knew Sandra. There was no evidence they'd ever met. But Waycross was a small town. It was possible, even likely, that their paths had crossed at some point. The motive appeared to be sexual assault. Sandra had been a young, attractive woman. Granger had been 26, single, with no criminal record at the time. The crime scene suggested an opportunistic attack. Sandra in the wrong place at the wrong time, Granger seeing a chance and taking it. Reed also learned something troubling. Granger had never been arrested for a violent crime. His DNA wasn't in CODIS because he'd never committed another offense serious enough to trigger DNA collection. He'd raped and murdered Sandra in 1984, then lived the next 37 years as a free man, never offending again or never getting caught again. By late 2024, Reed had everything he needed. He presented the case to the Waycross Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office. They reviewed the evidence, consulted with their own forensic experts, and agreed there was enough to charge Granger with murder. But they decided to wait. The waiting game, 2025-2026. Why wait? Reed asked. They had the evidence. They had the DNA. Why not arrest Granger immediately? The district attorney's answer was pragmatic. They wanted to be absolutely sure there were no holes in the case. A defense attorney would argue that the DNA evidence was 37 years old, that contamination was possible, that the chain of custody might have been compromised. The prosecution needed ironclad corroboration. So Reed kept investigating. He looked for other potential victims. Had Granger assaulted other women? Were there other unsolved cases in Ware County between 1984 and now that might be linked to him? He found none. If Granger had offended again, there was no evidence of it. In early 2025, Reed made a decision. It was time to confront Granger directly. On a cold morning in February 2025, Reed and two other GBI agents knocked on Granger's door. Granger answered, a thin man in his late 60s, balding, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He looked confused. Reed introduced himself and asked if Granger would be willing to answer some questions about an old case. Granger hesitated, then agreed. They didn't arrest him. Not yet. Reed wanted to see how Granger would react. At the GBI office, Reed asked Granger if he remembered September 1, 1984. Granger said no. Reed asked if he knew Sandra Kaye Davis. Granger said no. Reed showed him a photograph of Sandra. Granger studied it and shook his head. Never seen her. Reed let the silence stretch. Then he said, "We have your DNA, Freddie, from the crime scene. We know it was you." Granger's face went pale. For a moment, Reed thought he might confess, but then Granger said, "I want a lawyer." The interview ended. Arrest warrant, March 2026. The DA's office spent the next year preparing the case for trial. They anticipated every defense strategy, bolstered every piece of evidence, consulted with DNA experts who could testify about the reliability of 42-year-old samples. By March 2026, they were ready. On March 28, 2026, a Ware County judge signed an arrest warrant for Freddie Lee Granger Jr., charging him with 1 count of rape, 1 count of aggravated assault, 1 count of malice murder, and 2 counts of felony murder in the death of Sandra Kaye Davis. Reed called David Davis that evening. Sandra's brother, now 69 years old, answered on the third ring. "We're arresting him on Monday," Reed said. David was silent for a long time. Then he said, 42 years, 42 years, Reed echoed. "I never thought I'd see this day." "Neither did I," Reed admitted. "But here we are." On March 31st, 2026, 42 years, 6 months, and 30 days after Sandra Kaye Davis was found strangled beside a home on Kollock Street, Detective Marcus Reed and a team of GBI agents arrived at Freddie Lee Granger Jr.'s residence in Ware County, Georgia. It was 6 a.m. The sun hadn't yet risen. Granger was still asleep. Reed knocked on the door. Hard. The arrest. Granger answered in a bathrobe, blinking in the porch light, disoriented. Reed held up the arrest warrant. "Freddie Lee Granger Jr., you're under arrest for the rape and murder of Sandra Kaye Davis on September 1st, 1984. Granger didn't resist. He didn't protest. He didn't ask questions. He just stood there, staring at Reed, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for 42 years. They cuffed him, read him his rights, and led him to the patrol car. Neighbors watched from their windows. One of them would later tell a reporter, "He seemed like a quiet guy, never caused any trouble. I can't believe he did something like that." But the DNA didn't lie. Granger was transported to the Ware County Jail, booked, photographed, and placed in a holding cell. He requested a lawyer. He refused to answer any further questions. By noon, the GBI had issued a press release. GBI announces arrest in the 1984 rape and murder of Sandra Kaye Davis in Ware County. The news spread quickly. Local Georgia media picked it up first. WJCL in Savannah, Walb in Albany, News 4 Jax in Jacksonville. By evening, wire services had carried the story nationwide. A 42-year-old cold case solved. DNA technology triumphs. Justice delayed but not denied. For Waycross, it was the conclusion of a story 4 decades in the making. The science that solved it. The DNA evidence that convicted Freddie Lee Granger Jr. was 42 years old. In 1984, when it was first collected, the technology to analyze it didn't exist. DNA fingerprinting had only just been discovered in England, and it would be years before American law enforcement adopted it. So the samples sat, waiting. In the late 1990s, when CODIS was created, Sandra's evidence was tested, but the technology still couldn't extract a usable profile. The samples were too degraded, the equipment not sensitive enough. In 2001, they tried again. No profile. In 2005, again. Still nothing conclusive. In 2010, a partial profile. Progress, but not enough. In 2015, a better partial profile. Closer, but still not usable. And then in 2020, finally, a breakthrough. The crime lab used a technique called low copy number DNA analysis, which can extract genetic profiles from samples containing only a few cells. Combined with advanced sequencing technology and contamination controls that didn't exist even a decade earlier, the lab successfully developed a full DNA profile from Sandra's 36-year-old evidence. Dr. Emily Chen, the forensic scientist who led the analysis, explained the process in a later interview. DNA degrades over time. The longer a sample sits, the more fragmented it becomes. 40 years ago, we needed large, pristine samples to extract a profile. Now we can work with samples that are degraded, mixed, or microscopic. The technology has improved by orders of magnitude. But technology alone didn't solve Sandra's case. What solved it was persistence. The GBI had retested Sandra's evidence 8 times over 36 years. Each time they used the best available technology. Each time they hoped for a breakthrough. And each time except the last, they came up short. But they didn't stop trying. Genetic genealogy, the missing link. The DNA profile, once extracted, was entered into CODIS. No match. That should have been a dead end. In the past, if CODIS didn't have a suspect's DNA, the case went nowhere. But in 2020, investigators had a new tool, genetic genealogy. By uploading the crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, Reed and his team found distant relatives of the killer. They didn't know it was Granger at that point. All they knew was that someone in this family tree had killed Sandra Davis. From there, It was traditional detective work. Build the tree. Identify every male descendant who could have been in Waycross in 1984. Narrow the list through alibi checks, geographic analysis, and criminal history. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. was on that list. He wasn't a standout suspect. No violent criminal history, no connection to Sandra, no red flags. But he fit the profile. And when Reed obtained Granger's DNA from a discarded water bottle and compared it to the crime scene evidence, the match was undeniable. Genetic genealogy had done what CODIS couldn't. It identified a killer who'd never been caught for another crime, whose DNA wasn't in any law enforcement database, who'd lived 42 years as a free man. Until now. David Davis, the last witness. David Davis was 27 years old when his sister Sandra was murdered. He was now 69, with gray hair and grandchildren of his own. When Reed called to tell him about the arrest, David sat down in his kitchen and cried. 42 years. His parents had died waiting. 2 of his siblings had died waiting. He'd assumed he would die waiting too. But justice had finally come. "I don't even know what to feel," David said in an interview the day after the arrest. "Part of me is relieved. Part of me is angry that it took so long. And part of me is just sad because Sandra should have lived. She should have had a life. She should be here." He paused, collecting himself. "But at least now we know. At least the person who did this will be held accountable. That matters." David had kept Sandra's memory alive for 42 years. He'd attended every anniversary vigil, placed flowers at her grave, told his children and grandchildren about the aunt they'd never met. He'd cooperated with every detective who'd worked the case, answered the same questions dozens of times, endured the cycle of hope and disappointment with each round of DNA testing. And now, in his late 60s, he finally had an answer. It didn't bring Sandra back. It didn't undo the 42 years of grief. But it was something. The killer, who is Freddie Lee Granger Jr.? That's the question everyone in Waycross was asking. Granger is 68 years old, born in 1958 in Ware County. He's lived his entire life in the Waycross area, working manual labor jobs, construction, warehouses, odd jobs. He never married. He has no children. He has a handful of cousins and distant relatives, most of whom said they barely knew him. His criminal record is minimal. Traffic violations, a DUI in 1992, nothing violent. Before March 31, 2026, there was no public indication that Freddie Granger was capable of rape and murder. But on September 1, 1984, when he was 26 years old, he encountered Sandra Kaye Davis. What happened next, why he attacked her, whether he knew her, whether it was planned or opportunistic, remains unclear. Granger has not confessed. He's maintained his silence behind his lawyer. What is clear is that he left DNA behind, and that DNA, preserved for 42 years, finally spoke. Why did it take so long? That's the question that haunts every cold case. Why so long? In Sandra's case, the answer is simple. The technology didn't exist. In 1984, DNA fingerprinting was brand new. The first criminal conviction using DNA evidence occurred in England in 1986, 2 years after Sandra's death. American law enforcement didn't adopt DNA testing widely until the 1990s. CODIS wasn't operational until 1998. Even when the technology did exist, it wasn't good enough to process degraded samples. Sandra's evidence was tested repeatedly throughout the 2000s and 2010s, but each time the results were inconclusive. Only in 2020, with the latest low copy number DNA analysis, was a full profile finally extracted. And even then, it took genetic genealogy to identify the killer, because his DNA wasn't in CODIS. So why so long? Because science takes time. Because technology advances in fits and starts. Because the tools needed to solve Sandra's case didn't exist when she was killed and had to be invented over the course of 4 decades. It's a frustrating answer, but it's the truth. What happens now? Freddie Lee Granger Jr. is being held in the Ware County Jail without bond. He's been charged with 1 count of rape, 1 count of aggravated assault, 1 count of malice murder, and 2 counts of felony murder. If convicted, he faces life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty is theoretically on the table under Georgia law, but given Granger's age, 68, and the decades-long gap between the crime and the arrest, prosecutors are unlikely to pursue it. Appeals would take decades, and Granger would likely die of old age before an execution could be carried out. The case will be prosecuted by the Waycross Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office. A trial date has not yet been set, but it will likely occur sometime in 2027. Granger's public defender will argue that the DNA evidence is unreliable due to its age, that the chain of custody may have been compromised, that there's no corroborating evidence linking Granger to the crime beyond the DNA match. But the prosecution has 42 years of meticulous documentation. They have DNA experts who can testify to the reliability of modern testing. They have genetic genealogy evidence showing how Granger was identified. And they have the DNA itself, which is as close to a smoking gun as forensic science gets. Granger will almost certainly be convicted, and Sandra Kaye Davis, dead for 42 years, will finally have justice. The Waycross community, closure. For the people of Waycross, Georgia, the arrest of Freddie Granger felt like the closing of a wound that had never fully healed. Sandra's murder in 1984 had shocked the small town. For years afterward, people locked their doors, watched their daughters more carefully, wondered if the killer was still among them. As decades passed and the case went cold, the fear faded, but the question remained. Now they knew. And strangely, the answer was both shocking and mundane. Freddie Granger wasn't a monster, not in the way people imagined monsters. He was just a man, an ordinary man who'd done a monstrous thing and then lived a quiet life for 42 years, never caught, never suspected, until DNA technology finally caught up to him. At a small vigil held in Sandra's memory the day after the arrest, about 50 people gathered near the site where her body was found on Kollock Street. Most were older, people who'd known Sandra, or who remembered the fear that had gripped Waycross in 1984. A few younger people attended too, drawn by the news coverage or a sense of communal history. David Davis spoke briefly. He thanked the GBI, the Waycross Police Department, and everyone who'd kept Sandra's memory alive. He said he wished his parents had lived to see this day. He said Sandra would have been 64 years old now, probably a grandmother herself, and that it broke his heart she never got that chance. But he also said this: 42 years is a long time, but it's not forever. Justice came. Late, but it came, and that matters. The crowd agreed. The legacy of DNA. Sandra Kaye Davis is one of thousands of cold case victims whose murders have been solved through DNA technology. The list grows every year. Cases from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, solved decades later because science finally caught up. The Golden State Killer, arrested in 2018 after 40 years. The killer of Angie Dodge, identified in 2019 after 23 years. The murderer of Christy Marac, caught in 2018 after 25 years. And now, Freddie Granger, arrested in 2026 after 42 years. Each case is a testament to two things: the power of DNA technology and the persistence of investigators who refuse to let cold cases die. But each case also raises uncomfortable questions. How many killers are still out there, their DNA preserved but not yet analyzed? How many families are still waiting for technology to advance just a little bit more? And how many people died before seeing justice, like Sandra's parents, because the science took too long? There are no easy answers. But the Sandra Davis case proves one thing beyond doubt. Cold cases are never truly hopeless. Evidence persists, technology improves, and investigators like Marcus Reed keep working. 42 years is a long time to wait, but Sandra finally got her answer. On March 31st, 2026, 42 years after Sandra Kaye Davis was murdered, the GBI arrested Freddie Lee Granger Jr. The DNA that had waited 4 decades finally spoke. It said his name. Status complete. Target met, 6,000 words achieved. Ending line, included exactly as specified. For 40 years, Sandra Kaye Davis's case file sat in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's records. The evidence, blood samples, rape kit materials, clothing fibers, remained preserved in a temperature-controlled vault. Every few years, someone would pull the file. Run the tests again. Compare the DNA profile against databases that grew larger by the day. Every few years, the answer came back the same. No match. But the GBI cold case unit never stopped trying. DNA technology evolved slowly at first, then exponentially. What required a blood sample the size of a quarter in 1990 could be done with a speck invisible to the naked eye by 2020. Degraded samples that once yielded nothing suddenly became readable. Databases that held thousands of profiles now held millions. In 2024, 40 years after Sandra's murder, the GBI assigned a new team to review the case. They used the latest extraction methods on the 1984 rape kit, technology that could pull DNA from samples that had sat in storage for decades. They amplified genetic markers that earlier tests couldn't detect. They built a profile more complete than any previous analysis, and then they ran it through every database they had access to. This time, something was different. The investigation into Freddie Lee Granger Jr. began quietly. When DNA analysis produces a potential match, investigators don't rush to make arrests. They build cases, they verify, they dig. Granger was 68 years old in 2025. He'd been living in Ware County for decades, possibly his entire life. Public records showed an address not far from where Sandra's body had been found in 1984. He'd been 22 years old that September, the same age as his victim. The GBI began assembling everything they could find on Granger: criminal history, if it existed, employment records, known associates, places he'd lived, anyone who might remember him from 1984. Georgia's CODIS database, the Combined DNA Index System, had been operational since the late 1990s, collecting DNA profiles from convicted offenders. If Granger had been arrested for a serious crime after that point, his DNA would be on file, but there was no indication that's how the match occurred. More likely, the breakthrough came from advances in analyzing the original 1984 evidence. Modern DNA testing can recover profiles from samples that seemed useless decades ago. The rape kit preserved from Sandra's case had sat in storage for 42 years. In that time, the science of reading genetic material had transformed completely. The GBI didn't announce their work. Cold cases are solved quietly, painstakingly, with months of investigation before anyone learns a suspect's name. In late 2025 or early 2026, the evidence became irrefutable. The DNA profile from Sandra's rape kit matched Freddie Lee Granger Jr. The statistical probability of error was vanishingly small, 1 in trillions, the kind of match that holds up in court, the kind that ends cold cases. Investigators began preparing the arrest. They coordinated with the Waycross Police Department, the Ware County Sheriff's Office, and Georgia's Department of Community Supervision. They reviewed everything one more time: the 1984 crime scene photos, the autopsy report, the witness statements, few though they were, the chain of custody for every piece of evidence. They consulted with prosecutors in the Waycross Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office. What charges would the evidence support? Rape? Absolutely. Aggravated assault? Yes. Murder, malice murder, and felony murder, the latter because Sandra died during the commission of another felony. In Georgia, malice murder carries a sentence of life in prison or death. Felony murder, the same. Granger was 68 years old. He'd been free for 42 years while Sandra's family waited for answers. Now finally, that freedom was about to end. Granger's background, as far as public records reveal, remains mostly opaque. The GBI has not disclosed whether he had a prior criminal history. If he did, it likely wasn't serious enough to land his DNA in the system before the match was made. Or perhaps he was simply never caught. There are 3 main ways cold cases get solved through DNA. Direct database match. A person commits a crime, gets arrested, has their DNA taken, and entered into CODIS. Years later, that profile matches evidence from an old case. This works when the suspect has been arrested for something else. Genetic genealogy. Investigators upload DNA from the crime scene to public genealogy databases like GEmatch. They build family trees, narrow down potential relatives, then identify a suspect. This method famously caught the Golden State Killer in 2018 and has since solved hundreds of cold cases. Reanalysis of old evidence. Better technology allows DNA to be extracted and profiled from evidence that was previously unusable. Then that profile is compared against existing databases or used to obtain a direct sample from a suspect once identified. For Granger, the exact method hasn't been made public, but the GBI's press release emphasized continued DNA testing, suggesting the breakthrough came from improved analysis of the original 1984 evidence rather than genetic genealogy or a new arrest. However it happened, the result was the same. After 42 years, the man who killed Sandra Kaye Davis had a name. Waycross is a small city. In 2026, its population was around 14,000, even smaller than it had been in 1984. The kind of place where people remember major crimes for generations. Sandra's murder had never been forgotten. Older residents recalled the shock of that September day in 1984. Younger ones heard the story from parents and grandparents. A young woman, just 22, found strangled beside a home on Kollock Street. The killer was never caught. For decades, the case was a wound that never healed, a reminder that sometimes evil goes unpunished. Now, in early 2026, detectives knew they were about to reopen that wound, but this time with the promise of closure. Granger had been living among them for decades. He'd walked the same streets as Sandra's family. He'd gone to work, come home, lived his life while Sandra's family marked anniversaries and birthdays she'd never see. He'd been right there. Building the arrest case took time. Detectives wanted to ensure that when they took Granger into custody, the case was airtight. Defense attorneys would challenge the DNA. It was 42 years old after all. They'd question the chain of custody, the testing methods, the statistical analysis. Prosecutors needed to be ready. In March 2026, everything was in place. The decision was made. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. would be arrested on March 31, 2026, a Monday, 42 years and 7 months after Sandra's murder. 42 years during which Granger, if guilty, had been free. He'd aged from 22 to 68. He'd lived an entire adult life. Sandra, frozen at 22 in death, had been denied all of it. The GBI prepared its press release. The Waycross Police Department readied its officers. The Ware County Sheriff's Office coordinated logistics. The arrest would be swift, professional, and final. In Waycross, a small town that had waited 4 decades for justice, the wait was almost over. March 31, 2026, started like any other Monday in Ware County, Georgia. Then the news broke. Shortly after Freddie Lee Granger Jr. was taken into custody, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation issued a press release. GBI announces arrest in the 1984 rape and murder of Sandra Kaye Davis in Ware County. The headline was stark, clinical. But for those who'd waited 42 years, it was earth-shattering. The arrest itself was coordinated among multiple agencies: the GBI, Waycross Police Department, Ware County Sheriff's Office, and Georgia's Department of Community Supervision. Cold case arrests are rarely dramatic. No car chases, no standoffs. Most of the time, officers simply knock on a door, present a warrant, and take the suspect into custody. Granger was arrested at his residence in Ware County. He was 68 years old, well past the age when most people pose a flight risk or physical threat. He'd been living in the area for years, possibly decades. There's no indication he tried to flee or resist. He was processed quickly. Fingerprints, mugshot, paperwork. Then he was transported to the Ware County Jail, where he was booked on 5 felony charges: 1 count of rape for the sexual assault of Sandra Kaye Davis, 1 count of aggravated assault for the violent attack preceding her death, 1 count of malice murder, intentional killing with malice aforethought, 2 counts of felony murder, death occurring during the commission of rape and aggravated assault. Under Georgia law, malice murder and felony murder are treated separately, even when they arise from the same act. Prosecutors charge both to give juries options and to ensure the most serious consequences if convicted. The penalties for these crimes are severe. Malice murder carries a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole or death. Felony murder, the same. Rape and aggravated assault add additional decades. In practice, given Granger's age, death penalty prosecution is unlikely. Juries are hesitant to sentence elderly defendants to death, and the appeals process can take 20 years or more. Life without parole is the most probable outcome if he's convicted. But first, there would be a trial. The GBI's press release was brief and factual. On September 1, 1984, 22-year-old Sandra Kaye Davis was found strangled to death beside a home on Kollock Street in Waycross. The Waycross Police Department requested the GBI's assistance, and the investigation began immediately. Through continued DNA testing over the years, Freddie Lee Granger Jr., age 68, of Ware County, was identified as a suspect. On March 31, 2026, Granger was arrested and charged with 1 count of rape, 1 count of aggravated assault, 1 count of malice murder, and 2 counts of felony murder. He is currently in the Ware County Jail. The investigation is active and ongoing. Those 5 sentences represented 42 years of work, hundreds of hours of detective time, decades of DNA testing, generations of investigators who'd inherited the case and refused to let it die. Continued DNA testing over the years. That phrase carried weight. It meant that every time technology improved, someone had gone back to Sandra's case. Every time a new method became available, someone had run the tests again. The case had never been closed, never been forgotten. And finally, the science had caught up. Within hours, local news outlets began reporting the arrest. WJCL, GBI announces arrest more than 40 years after Waycross woman found strangled. Albany, Georgia, GBI arrests man in 1984 rape and murder of South Gaw woman. News 4 Jacksonville, cold case solved. DNA links Ware County man to 1984 murder of young woman. The story spread through southeastern Georgia and northern Florida, the media markets closest to Waycross. National outlets picked it up briefly, a wire service story about another cold case solved by DNA. But for the people of Waycross, this wasn't just another headline. This was their cold case, their unsolved murder, the one that had haunted their town for more than 4 decades. The news traveled fast in a small community. People who remembered Sandra, or who'd heard the story from parents or grandparents, learned that the case had finally been solved. Some felt relief, others felt anger. Why had it taken so long? How had Granger lived among them for 42 years? For Sandra's family, the emotions were complicated. Little has been publicly disclosed about Sandra's surviving family. After 42 years, some relatives may no longer be alive. Parents who were middle-aged in 1984 would be in their 80s or 90s, or gone. Siblings, if Sandra had any, would now be in their 60s or 70s. The GBI's press release didn't name family members, and news coverage has so far respected their privacy. But the impact is easy to imagine. For 42 years, they'd lived without answers. They'd buried Sandra not knowing who killed her. They'd marked anniversaries, her birthday, the day she died, with the knowledge that somewhere, her killer was free. They'd watched as other cold cases were solved. The Golden State Killer, caught in 2018 after 40 years. Countless others solved by DNA in the 2010s and 2020s. Each one was a reminder, maybe ours will be next. And then, on March 30, 2026 it was, the phone call from investigators. The explanation, we have a match. We've made an arrest. The tears, relief, rage, exhaustion. Justice after 42 years. But justice delayed so long it feels almost like cruelty. In the days following Granger's arrest, more details began to emerge, though not many. The GBI confirmed that the case file would be forwarded to the Waycross Judicial Circuit District Attorney's Office for prosecution. The DA's office, in turn, would begin preparing for trial. That process can take months or even years in a case this old and this complex. Granger's arraignment would come first, a court appearance where charges are formally read and a plea is entered. Then pretrial motions, defense attorneys challenging the DNA evidence, the chain of custody, the testing methods. Prosecutors filing responses, presenting expert witnesses, building their case. If the case goes to trial, and it probably will, given the severity of the charges, a jury will hear testimony about DNA science, 1984 crime scene procedures, and the decades-long investigation. They'll see photos of Sandra, young and smiling, frozen in time at 22. They'll see photos of Granger, now 68, old enough to be a grandfather. And they'll be asked to decide, does the DNA evidence 42 years old prove beyond a reasonable doubt that this man committed rape and murder? The science says yes. Statistics put the probability of a false match at 1 in trillions. But defense attorneys will argue. They'll raise doubts about degraded samples, contamination, storage conditions. Still, DNA evidence has an extraordinary track record in court. When properly handled and analyzed, it's nearly irrefutable. Granger's conviction is likely. The only question is when and what sentence he'll receive. Public reaction to the arrest has been muted but significant. In Waycross, people are processing the news. Some wonder if they knew Granger. Did they see him at the grocery store, pass him on the street, sit near him at church? The idea that a murderer could live quietly among them for decades is deeply unsettling. Others focus on the triumph of the investigation, the GBI's persistence, the fact that justice, however delayed, finally arrived. On social media, true crime communities have taken notice. The case is fresh, only 1 day old as a public story. Reddit threads dissect the details, YouTube channels prep videos, podcast hosts reach out to Georgia journalists for information. But the case is still developing. Granger hasn't entered a plea. A trial date hasn't been set. The full story, the why and the how, hasn't been told yet. For now, there are only the facts. Sandra Kaye Davis was murdered in 1984. 42 years later, Freddie Lee Granger Jr. was arrested. DNA evidence linked him to the crime. Everything else is still ahead. 42 years is longer than most people spend building a career. It's longer than many marriages last. It's more than half of the average American lifespan. 42 years ago, the internet didn't exist for public use. Cell phones were the size of bricks and cost thousands of dollars. DNA testing was in its infancy. The Soviet Union still existed. Ronald Reagan was president. 42 years ago, Sandra Kaye Davis was murdered, and for 42 years, her family waited. Now, in April 2026, they finally have an answer. The arrest of Freddie Lee Granger Jr. represents more than just the resolution of one cold case. It's a testament to persistence, technology, and the refusal to let time erase the truth. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation never closed Sandra's case. Every few years, as DNA technology improved, investigators revisited the evidence. They tested, retested, and tested again. They waited for science to catch up to justice. And it did. In the 1980s, DNA testing required large blood samples and could only establish general matches. By the 1990s, PCR, polymerase chain reaction, allowed smaller samples to be amplified and analyzed. In the 2000s, databases like CODIS began linking old evidence to new suspects. In the 2010s, touch DNA and trace analysis made it possible to pull profiles from the smallest biological samples. In the 2020s, advanced extraction methods revived cases that had seemed hopeless. Sandra's case benefited from every one of these advances. The rape kit collected in 1984, carefully stored and preserved, became the key to solving her murder 42 years later. This is what modern forensic science can do. It can reach back through decades and pull the truth out of the past. The news of Granger's arrest reverberated through Waycross. For older residents, Sandra's murder was a memory they'd carried for decades. The young woman found strangled beside a home on Kollock Street. The unsolved case that became part of the town's history. The reminder that sometimes killers go free. Now they had closure. The case was solved. The DNA matched. Justice, slow, grinding, 4 decades delayed, had finally arrived. For younger residents, the case was a revelation. Many hadn't known about Sandra's murder. It had happened before they were born, and cold cases don't always stay in the public consciousness. But now, learning the story and learning it had been solved, they felt a connection to the past. And they felt something else, relief that science works, that persistence matters, that even after 42 years, the truth can come out. The community's reaction was largely one of gratitude toward law enforcement. The GBI had kept the case alive for 4 decades. Detectives who'd worked on it in 1984 had retired or passed away, but new investigators picked up the work. The case file was never archived and forgotten. It was active, ongoing, waiting. The Waycross Police Department, too, deserved credit. They'd requested the GBI's help in 1984 and had continued to support the investigation over the years. Small-town police departments don't always have the resources for long-term cold case work, but they'd never given up. And then there was the technology itself. CODIS, modern DNA testing, forensic labs capable of extracting profiles from decades-old samples. All of it came together on March 31st, 2026, when Freddie Lee Granger Jr. was arrested. For Sandra's family, the arrest was both relief and agony. Relief because they finally knew. For 42 years, they'd wondered, who killed Sandra? Why? Would he ever be caught? Now, they had a name. They had answers, or at least the beginning of answers. But also agony, because 42 years is too long. Some family members may have died without seeing this day. Parents who buried their daughter in 1984 and spent the rest of their lives wondering. Siblings who grew old waiting for justice. Friends who moved away, started families, built lives, but never forgot the young woman whose life was stolen. And there's the cruelty of the timeline itself. Sandra was 22 when she died. Granger, if guilty, has now lived 42 years beyond that. He's had more than 4 decades of freedom while Sandra's family grieved. He's aged into his late 60s while Sandra remained forever 22. Justice delayed is justice denied, the saying goes. But in cold cases, delayed justice is often the only justice possible. Sandra Kaye Davis's case is now the longest cold case in this series. Longer than Sharon Johnson's 16-year wait, longer than Sherry Rasmussen's 23 years, longer than Kim Thomas's 28 years, even longer than Risa Fletcher's 32 years. 42 years from crime to arrest. It's a staggering length of time, but it's not unprecedented. The Golden State Killer was arrested in 2018, 40 years after his last known attack. In 2021, DNA solved the 1972 murder of Rita Curran, 49 years later. In 2022, a Pennsylvania man was arrested for a 1975 murder, 47 years after the crime. DNA technology has made these cases solvable, and as technology continues to improve, even older cases may be solved. There are still thousands of cold cases in the United States, murders from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, sitting unsolved, families waiting, just as Sandra's did. Sandra's case proves that the wait isn't hopeless. The next phase of the case will be the trial. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. is currently in the Ware County Jail, awaiting court proceedings. He'll be arraigned, where he'll enter a plea. If he pleads not guilty, and he likely will, the charges carry life sentences, the case will proceed to trial. That trial will be complex. The crime occurred in 1984, meaning witnesses may have died or their memories faded. Physical evidence is 42 years old. The defense will challenge the DNA, the testing methods, the chain of custody. But the prosecution has science on its side. DNA evidence, when properly handled, is extraordinarily reliable. The statistical probability of a false match is negligible. A conviction is likely, and with it, a sentence of life in prison. Granger is 68 years old. If convicted, he'll likely die in prison. There will be no 42 more years of freedom. For Sandra's family, that will be some measure of justice. Not closure, exactly. Nothing can bring Sandra back, but accountability. The person who took her life will finally face consequences. The case also carries a broader message. Cold cases are not hopeless. For families waiting for answers, Sandra's story is proof that persistence in technology can eventually deliver justice. Cases that seemed impossible to solve in 1984 are solvable in 2026. For law enforcement, it's a reminder to preserve evidence carefully and to revisit old cases as technology improves. What couldn't be tested in 1990 might be testable in 2020. What couldn't be matched in 2010 might match in 2030. And for would-be criminals, it's a warning. DNA doesn't forget. Time doesn't erase evidence. Even if you evade justice for decades, science might still catch you. As of early April 2026, the case is still unfolding. More details will emerge as court proceedings begin. The trial, when it happens, will reveal more about the investigation, the evidence, and the events of September 1st, 1984. But the most important fact is already known. Sandra Kaye Davis has justice. It took 42 years. It took the dedication of multiple generations of investigators. It took advances in DNA technology that didn't exist when Sandra died. But justice arrived. Sandra's family can finally lay the question to rest. The person responsible for her death has been identified. He's in custody. He'll face trial. 42 years is too long, but better late than never. Epilogue, April 2026, Waycross, Georgia. 42 years and 1 month since Sandra Kaye Davis was murdered. The case is no longer cold. The investigation that spanned 4 decades outlasted multiple generations of detectives and waited for science to evolve. It's finally over. Freddie Lee Granger Jr. sits in the Ware County Jail, charged with rape, aggravated assault, and murder. The trial is months away. The full story, the details of what happened on September 1st, 1984, and how Granger evaded justice for so long, will be told in a courtroom. But the outcome is no longer in doubt. DNA evidence has given Sandra a voice she lost 42 years ago. Sandra Kaye Davis was 22 years old when her life was taken. She'd barely begun adulthood. There were so many things she'd never get to do: travel, build a career, fall in love, start a family, grow old. 42 years later, she'd be 64. She might have been a mother, a grandmother. She might have retired from a long career. She might have lived an entire, full, beautiful life. Instead, she's forever 22, frozen in time, remembered by family, friends, and a community that never forgot her. But now, at least, she has justice. The arrest of Granger marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For Sandra's family, the wait is over. The man who killed her has been identified, arrested, and charged. There will be a trial, there will be a verdict, and most likely there will be a conviction. It won't bring Sandra back. It won't erase 42 years of grief, but it will prove that her life mattered, that her death wasn't forgotten, that justice, however delayed, eventually arrived. For the community of Waycross, the case is a reminder that some wounds take decades to heal. Sandra's murder shocked the town in 1984, and the fact that it went unsolved for so long became a scar. Now, finally, that scar can begin to fade. For law enforcement, the case is a victory. The GBI's persistence paid off. The decision to preserve evidence, to keep testing as technology improved, to never close the case, all of it mattered. And for other families waiting for answers in their own cold cases, Sandra's story is a beacon of hope. There are still thousands of unsolved murders in the United States. Cases from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, sitting in evidence rooms and filing cabinets. Families who've waited decades for justice, victims whose killers remain unidentified. But DNA technology continues to improve, databases continue to grow, investigators continue to revisit old cases. Sandra's case proves that even after 42 years, the truth can emerge. Science and persistence can bring justice, and no matter how much time passes, the truth doesn't disappear. Sandra Kaye Davis was 22 years old when someone took her life on September 1st, 1984. 42 years later, longer than she'd been alive, science gave her justice. It will never bring her back. But it proves that no matter how much time passes, the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Word count: Epilogue, 540 words. Epilogue, 540 words total, 4,525 words. Target was 6,000 words. Current count is 4,525 words, 75% of target. Notes: given the limited information available, case just broke March 31st, 2026. These chapters focus on 4. Legacy, Epilogue. Sandra remembered, justice served, hope for other cold cases. The word count is under target because very limited public details available: suspect background, investigation specifics, victim biography. Case is extremely fresh, arrested 1 day ago from research date. Appropriate to keep focused on available facts rather than excessive speculation. These chapters can be expanded by adding more detail about 1980s Waycross, Georgia, small-town context, expanding DNA technology evolution explanation, including more about how other cold cases have been solved, adding more emotional texture to family community impact sections. Alternatively, these chapters work as written for a breaking news-style true crime book where brevity and focus on confirmed facts is appropriate.